Georg Friedrich Hegel, Lectures on the Proofs of the Existence of God, translated by Ebenezer Brown Spears, read by Cien de San Fernando. Second lecture. If the undertaking which is commonly called proof of the existence of God has been understood in the form in which it was set forth in the first lecture, the chief objection to it will have been got rid of. For the nature of proof was held to consist in this, that it is only the consciousness of the proper movement of the object in itself. If this thought might be attended with difficulties in its application to other objects, these difficulties would necessarily disappear in the case of the object with which we are concerned. For it is not a passive and external object, but really a subjective movement, the elevation of the spirit to God, an activity, the following of a certain course, a process, and thus has in it that necessary procedure which constitutes proof, and which has only to be taken up and studied in order that it may be seen to involve proof. But the expression proof carries with it too definitely the idea of a merely subjective line of thought to be followed on our behoof. To allow of the conception of it just stated being considered sufficient in itself, apart from any attempt to expressly examine and get rid of this contrasted idea. In this lecture, then, we must first come to an understanding about the nature of proof in general, and with especial definiteness as regards the aspect of it which we here put aside and exclude. It is not our business to assert that there is no proof of the kind indicated, but to assign its limits, and to see that it is not, as is falsely thought, the only form of proof. This is bound up with the contrast drawn between immediate and mediated knowledge, in which in our time the chief interest centers in connection with religious knowledge, and even the religious frame of mind itself, which must accordingly be likewise considered. The distinction, which has already been touched upon in connection with knowledge, implies that two kinds of proof must be taken into account, of which the one is clearly that which we use simply as an aid to knowledge, as something subjective, whose activity and movement have their place within ourselves, and are not the particular movement of the thing considered. That this kind of proof finds a place in the scientific knowledge of finite things and their finite content becomes apparent when we examine the nature of the procedure more closely. Let us take for this purpose an example from a science in which this method of proof is admittedly applied in its most complete form. If we prove a geometrical proposition, every part of the proof must in part carry its justification within itself. So also when we solve an equation in algebra. In part, however, the whole course of procedure is defined and justified through the aim which we have in connection with this, and because that end is attained by such procedure. But we are very well aware that that of which the quantitative value has been developed out of the equation has not an actual thing run through these operations in order to reach the quantity which it possesses, and that the magnitude of the geometrical lines, angles, and so on has not gone through and been brought about by the series of propositions by which we have arrived at it as representing a result. The necessity which we see in such proof corresponds indeed to the individual properties of the object itself. These relations of quantity actually belong to it, but the progress in connecting the one with the other is something which goes on entirely within us. It is a process for realizing the aim we have in view, namely, to see into the meaning of the thing, not a course in which the object arrives at its inherent relations and their connection. It does not thus create itself, and is not created as we create it and its relations in the process of attaining insight into it. Besides proof proper, of which the essential characteristic, for this is all that is necessary for the purpose of our investigation, has been brought out, we find further that in the region of finite knowledge the term proof is also applied to what, when more closely examined, is only the indicating of something, the pointing out of an idea, a proposition, a law, and so on in experience. Historical proof we do not require from the point of view from which we here consider knowledge. To elaborate in detail, it depends for its material on experience or rather perception. Looked at in one light, it makes no difference that it has reference to foreign perceptions and their evidences. Argumentation, that is to say, the exercise of understanding proper regarding the objective connection of circumstances and actions, makes these data into presuppositions and fundamental assumptions, just as its criticism of evidences has done in drawing its conclusions. But insofar as argument and criticism constitute the other essential side of historical proof, such proof treats its data as being the ideas of other people. The subjective element directly enters into the material, and the reasoning about the combination of that material is likewise subjective activity. So that the course and activity of knowledge has quite different ingredients from the course followed by the circumstances themselves. As regards the pointing things out in everyday experience, this is certainly concerned, in the first instance, with individual perceptions, observations, and so on, that is to say, with the kind of material which is only pointed out, but its interest is by so doing to prove further that there are in nature and in spirit such species and kinds, such laws, forces, faculties, and activities as are mentioned in the sciences. We pass by the metaphysical or common psychological reflections about the subjective element of sense, external and internal, which accompanies perception, but the material, however, insofar as it enters into the sciences, is not so left to itself as it is in the senses and in perception. On the contrary, the content of the sciences, the species, kinds, laws, forces, and so on, is built up out of that material which is perhaps already called by the name of phenomena, by putting together through analysis what is common, the leaving aside of what is not essential, the retention of what is called essential, without any certain test having been applied to distinguish between what is to be regarded as non essential and what as essential. It is admitted that what is perceived does not itself make these abstractions, does not compare its individuals, or individual positions, circumstances, and so on, or put what is common in them together. That therefore a great part of the activity of knowledge is a subjective affair, just as in the content which has been obtained a part of its definition as being logical forms are the product of this subjective activity. The expression predicate or mark merkmal, if people will still use this stupid expression, directly indicates a subjective purpose of isolating properties for our use in marking distinctions, while others, which likewise exist in the subject, are put aside. This expression is to be called stupid because the definitions of species and kinds directly pass for something essential and objective, and not as existing merely for us who mark distinction. We may certainly also express ourselves by saying that the species leaves aside in one kind properties which it places in another, or that energy in one form of its manifestation leaves aside circumstances which are present in another. that these circumstances are thus shown by it to be unessential, and it is of itself gives up the form of its manifestation, and withdraws itself into inactivity or self containedness, that thus, for example, the law of the motion of the heavenly bodies penetrates to every single place and every moment in which the heavenly bodies occupy that place. And just by this continual abstraction shows itself to be a law. If we thus look on abstraction as objective activity, which it so far is, it is yet very different from subjective activity and its products. The former leaves the heavenly body to fall back again after abstraction from this particular place and this particular moment into the particular changing place and moment of time, just as the species may appear in the kind in other contingent or unessential forms and in the external particularity of individuals. On the other hand, subjective abstraction raises the law like the species into its universality as such, and makes it exist and preserves it in this form in the mind. In these forms of the knowledge which progresses from mere indication to proof, from immediate objectivity to special products, the necessity may be felt of considering explicitly the method, the nature, and fashion of the subjective activity in order to test its claims and procedure. For this method has its own characteristics and kind of progress which are quite different from the characteristics and process of the object in itself. And without entering more particularly into the nature of this method of knowledge, it becomes immediately apparent from a single characteristic which we observe in it, that inasmuch as it is represented as being concerned with the object in accordance with subjective forms, it is only capable of apprehending relations of the object. It is therefore idle to start the question whether these relations are objective and real or only subjective and ideal. Not to mention the fact that such expressions as subjectivity and objectivity, reality and ideality, are simply vague abstractions. The content, be it objective or merely subjective, real or ideal, remains always the same, an aggregate of relations, not something that is in and for itself the notion of the thing or the infinite with which knowledge must have to do. If that content of knowledge is taken by perverted sense as containing relations only, and these are understood to be phenomena or relations to a faculty of subjective knowledge, it must, so far as results are concerned, always be recognized as representing the great intellectual advance which modern philosophy has achieved. That the mode of thinking, proving, and knowing the infinite which has been described is proved incapable of reaching what is eternal and divine. What has been brought out in the preceding exposition regarding knowledge in general, and especially what relates to thinking knowledge, which is what alone concerns us, and to proof, the principal moment in that knowledge we have looked at from the point of view from which it is seen to be a movement of the activity of thought, which is outside the object and different from the development of the object itself. This definition may in part be taken to be sufficient for our purpose, but partly, too, it is to be taken as what is essential in opposition to the one sidedness which lies in the reflections about the subjectivity of knowledge. In the opposition of the process of knowledge to the object to be known lies the finiteness of knowledge. But this opposition is not on the account to be regarded as itself infinite and absolute, and its products are not to be taken to be appearances only because of the mere abstraction of subjectivity, but insofar as they themselves are determined by that opposition, The content as such is affected by the externality referred to it. This point of view has an effect upon the nature of the content and yields a definite insight into it, while, on the contrary, the other way of looking at the question gives us nothing but the abstract category of the subjective, which is moreover taken to be absolute. What we thus get as the result of the way in which we look at the proof for the otherwise quite general quality of the content is, speaking generally, just this: that the content, inasmuch as it bears an external relation to knowledge, is itself determined as something external, or to put it more definitely, consists of abstractions from finite properties. Mathematical content as such is essentially magnitude. Geometrical figures pertain to space and have thus in themselves externality as their principle, since they are distinguished from real objects and represent only the one-sided spatiality of these objects as distinguished from their concrete filling up through which they first become real. So number has the unit for its principle and is the putting together of a multiplicity of units which are independent and is thus a completely external combination. The knowledge which we have here before us can only attain its great perfection in this field, epistemology, because that field contains only simple and definite qualities, and the dependence of these upon each other, the insight into the nature of which is proof, is thus stable and ensures for proof the logical progress of necessity. This kind of knowledge is capable of exhausting the nature of its objects. The logical nature of the process of proof is not, however, confined to mathematical content, but enters into all departments of natural and spiritual material. But we may sum up what is logical in knowledge in connection with proof by saying that it depends on the rules of inference. The proofs of the existence of God are therefore essentially inferences. The express investigation of these forms belong, however, partly to logic, and for the rest, the nature of the fundamental defect must be ascertained in the course of the examination of these proofs, which is about to be taken in hand. For the present, it is enough to remark further, in connection with what has been said, that the rules of inference have a kind of foundation which is of the nature of mathematical calculation. The connection of propositions which are requisite to constitute a syllogistic conclusion depends on the relations of the sphere which each of them occupies as regards the other, and which is quite properly regarded as greater or smaller. The definite extent of such a sphere is what determines the correctness of the subsumption. The older logicians, such as Lambert and Ploucquet, but have been at the pains of inventing a notation by means of which the relation in inference may be reduced to that of identity, that is, to the abstract mathematical relation of equality, so that inference is shown to be the mechanism of a kind of calculation. As regards, however, the further nature of knowledge in such an external connection of objects, which in their very nature are external in themselves, we shall have to speak of it presently under the name of mediate knowledge, and to consider the opposition in its more definite form. As regards these forms, which are called species, laws, forces, and so on, knowledge does not stand to them in an external relation. They are rather its product, but the knowledge which produces them, as has been shown, produces them only by abstraction from what is objective. They have their root in this, but are essentially separated from what is actual. They are more concrete than mathematical figures, but their content differs essentially from that from which the start was made, and which must constitute their only foundation of proof. The defective element in this mode of knowledge has thus attention drawn to it in a different form from that shown in the way of looking at it, which declares the products of knowledge to be mere phenomena, because knowledge itself is only a subjective activity. But the general result, however, is the same, and we have now to see what has been said over against this result. What is determined as insufficient for the aim of the spirit, which is the absorption into its very nature of what is infinite, eternal, divine, and the activity of the spirit, which in thinking proceeds by means of abstraction, inference, and proof, this view itself, the product of the mode of thought characteristic of the period, has jumped straight over to the other extreme in giving out proofless immediate knowledge and unreasoning faith, a feeling devoid of thought, as the only way of grasping and having within oneself divine truth. It is asserted that that kind of knowledge which is insufficient for the higher kind of truth is the exclusive and sole kind of knowledge. The two assumptions are most closely connected. On the one side, we have in the investigation of what we have undertaken to consider, to free that knowledge from its one-sidedness, and in doing so at the same time, to show by facts that there exists another kind of knowledge than that which is given out as the only kind. On the other side, the pretension which faith as such sets up against knowledge is a prejudice which occupies too firm and sure a position not to make a stricter investigation necessary. In view of this pretension, it must be borne in mind that the true unsophisticated faith, the more the it must be borne in mind that the true, unsophisticated faith, the more it in case of dire necessity, might reasonably make pretensions. Again, in view of this pretension, it must be borne in mind that the true, unsophisticated faith, the more it in case of dire necessity might reasonably make pretensions, the less it does make them, and that the case of necessity exists only for the merely rationalizing, dry, and polemical assertion of faith. But I have elsewhere already explained how the matter stands as regard that faith or immediate knowledge. It is not possible that in the forefront of any attempt to deal at the present time with the proofs of the existence of God, the position taken up by faith can be set aside as done with, the chief points from which it is to be criticized and the place to be assigned to it must at least be called to mind. End of Lecture 2.